Welcome, everyone. We're going to start in just a few minutes. Hi, everyone. We're still waiting for a few more people to show up, so hang tight. Hi, Pam. We'll be announcing our next series at the end of today's talk, so hopefully that's an incentive for you to stay on the entire time.
All right, I think we're ready to begin. Welcome everyone to Jane Austen and Company. My name is Ann Ferdig and I'm a doctoral candidate in the Department of English and Comparative Literature at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, as well as the founder and co-director of Jane Austen and Company. Jane Austen and Company is a free public humanities series hosted by the Jane Austen Summer Program. We started off in 2019 at Durham Public Library, but we took our series online in 2020 to bring you Staying Home with Jane Austen, a series looking at the domestic work and relationships in Austen's novels. Today, we're thrilled to welcome our sixth speaker in the series, Jo Ann Staples, who's going to be talking about playing games with Jane Austen. But first, a word from my co-host, Inga Brody.
Hi, I'm Inga Brody. I teach at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I'm the founder and director of Jane Austen Summer Program, which is our umbrella organization, which for this series and several other of our initiatives. We are delighted that this series has had such a following, with hundreds of people signing up for each event. And this virtual series has enabled us to bring people from far and wide, from New Zealand and England and various places where we otherwise couldn't afford to bring the people in to speak. And thankful for Anne for founding this whole event. So Jo Ann, I would like to tell you about our speaker for tonight, Jo Ann Staples, whose career was in the Department of Mathematics at Vanderbilt University. And she has taught in the classroom for over 30 years and has been a member of JASNA for more than 15 years, the Jane Austen Society of North America. And she has been attending those annual meetings since she became a regional coordinator for the Middle Tennessee region. She held that position for 7 years. And during her time with JASNA, she's given many talks, and she's also organized parties, card parties, dance dances Regency dinners. Also, she's also given presentations on household remedies in Regency era, which is going to be one of our future topics. And last year at the AGM in Williamsburg, she gave a special interest session on playing cards in Austen's novels. And at this coming annual meeting for the Jane Austen Society of North America in the first week of October, she will be speaking again about cards. And her first book is entitled Jane Austen's Card Games. I highly recommend it. It also includes recipes and it's a whole evening plan all together in one book. And she's also working on a second book on the broader issue of games in Jane Austen. So welcome, Joanne. So happy to have you.
Thank you.
And now I'd like to introduce Emily Spera, who a lot of you recognize as our technical director and who's also served as the Register of JASP for many years now. Emily is also a graduate student and teaching fellow at UNC. She's going to go over the schedule for tonight, as well as how the Q&A will work.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. It's so great to see some familiar names popping up in the chat box. So tonight, after we're done with our introductions, which will be very soon, I promise, Joanne will speak to us for about 40 or so minutes. After that, we'll have a Q&A session. So tonight's entire event will last about 90 minutes in total. For the Q&A session, you can see that there are several ways to participate at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Many of you have found the chat option already, and we'd like to ask that when you have questions specifically for Joanne during the Q&A session, to please use the Q&A box rather than the chat box. The chat box gets to be pretty lively sometimes, and the Q&A box will help Anne and Inger to know which questions they should ask to Joanne when it comes to be the appropriate time. So that's how you should participate during that point. And then be sure to stick around after the Q&A just part of tonight's talk. We have a few special announcements for our next events, and also we would like to announce the winners of our creative writing contest. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. Please do note that tonight's program will be recorded. If you have to leave or drop out because of technical difficulties, we'll announce on our Facebook and our email when it is available to view. And without further ado, I'd like to hand things over to Joanne.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Playing Games with Jane Austen. Before I start, I'd like to say a special thank you to Inger and Emily and Anne, not just for their help with the program tonight, but also for bringing Jane Austen into our homes during a summer that's been difficult for a lot of people. I've really enjoyed all the programs, and I'm looking forward to the ones in the future. So we're going to start out with, hopefully, my screen advancing here. Let's see. There we go. Jane Austen's games can be divided into 3 categories, and we have a good reason to look at these games because one of her contemporaries and a writer of the time, who was an antiquarian and historian and wrote several books about the everyday life of the English people, Joseph Strutt, said in 1801, in order to form a just estimation of the character of any particular people, it is absolutely necessary to investigate the sports and activities most generally prevalent among them. Well, from Jane Austen's works and from the Austen family, we have children's games, word games, and card games. We start with children's games because Jane Austen took her responsibilities as an aunt very seriously. And she wrote to Cassandra in 1808 when Jane and her mother were keeping some of Edward Austen Knight's children. We do not want amusement. Bilbo Catch, Spillikins, paper ships, riddles, conundrums, and cards. We're going to take a cue from this and look at all of these things except paper ships. Jane Austen's first biographer, her nephew, James Edward Austen Lee, wrote that Jane Austen was successful with anything she attempted with her fingers. None of us could throw Spillikins in so perfect a circle or take them off with so steady a hand. Her performances with Cup and Ball or Bilbo Catch were marvelous. And if you look at the two pictures on the right, you can see what these two games are. Spillikins is what we call pickup sticks when I was a child. And Bilbo Catch is just the old-fashioned cup and ball game. Starting with Spillikins, the English also wrote Spellicans in the early days. And the sets that Jane Austen would have been familiar with were made of ivory, bone, or wood. And if you look at the picture, you will see what makes these different from modern day pickup sticks, which are just plain pieces of wood or plastic. These were often carved into elaborate shapes. And the idea of the game was to pick all of the sticks up, hold them in a bundle, and drop them. And then each player would take turns trying to pick up as many sticks as possible without moving anything else. And when I was little, we played this with our fingers, but Jane Austen would have played it with the two hooks that you see on the bottom left. And on the right, you can see how the hooks were used to move the sticks. The game originated in China, where it was called Qian Tung, and then it moved through the Middle East and to Europe. In Europe, it's called Mikado, and in the US, we call it jackstraws or pickup sticks. And jackstraws is a really old game in this country. It dates back to the Native Americans, and they used sticks or pieces of straw to play the game. Now, the best sets were made of ivory and came from China. And if you look at all the elaborate shapes on the left, you can see some of those would be a lot harder to pick up than others. So you got different point values, which were marked on each one of the sticks based on how hard it was to pick up an individual stick. Jane Austen called her own family Spillikin set a valuable part of our household furniture. That Spillikin set is still around today. This is a picture of it. It's in the museum at Lyme Regis. It's made out of ivory. It's very small, so it seems to be a child size, and it was a gift from Jane Austen's brother, Edward. And it's shown here with some other household objects that are also associated with games. And those are the fish-shaped game tokens in the middle, and then the alphabet squares on the bottom. Bilbo Catch is a corruption of the French word bilboquet, which is used for the term cup and ball. And I found a picture of an early example from the Victoria and Albert Museum of Childhood. And this dates to the early 1800s. And the way the game worked was you had a solid ball on a string attached to a handle. And the handle has two ends. One end has a shallow cup on it, and the other end has a spike. And if you want to use the end with the spike, you have to swing the ball up and out and catch it using the hole that's in the bottom of the ball. Now, I know this is hard because we bought a cup and ball set in Colonial Williamsburg that had a spike on one end, and none of us have been able to catch it on the spike. But Jane Austen was very good at this. Her nephew, James Edward Austen Lee, again, said the one used at Chawton was an easy one, and she has been known to catch it above 100 times in succession until her hand was weary. Now, I think she had great hand-eye coordination because her mother said, "I've never been able to catch it on the spike." Now, there was a nice surprise at the BBC Antiques Roadshow in 2007. When Jane Austen's great-great-great-great-nephew showed up with her cup and ball. And the nice thing about this picture is that it shows the relative size of her cup and ball, but it also shows the expression when the estimate was given at 20 to 30,000 pounds for the value of it. And 9 years later, the family decided to offer it for sale at Sotheby's. And there was a reserve price of 25 to 30,000 pounds, but it failed to sell. So now it's on display at Jane Austen's House Museum in Chawton. Another game that the Austen family played was battledore and shuttlecock. And Jane wrote in 2005 about having a quiet day where her most vigorous activity was playing at battledore and shuttlecock with William, her nephew. He and I have practiced together 2 mornings and improved a little. We frequently kept it up 3 times and once or twice 6. If you look at the picture at the bottom, you can see that the game is like a game that we play today, but there's no net and you can have multiple players. And the only object is to keep the birdie up in the air as long as you can. And if anybody lets it fall to the ground, then someone else steps in to play. Now, the game had no net and people often played it indoors. And the equipment that you needed was a bat, which was called the battledore. And in the olden times, it was made out of solid wood, carved out of a single piece of wood, which would have been pretty heavy. So the next development was to hollow out the top of it and make it a simple frame, and then stretch over that skin or parchment. And then the next step was replacing that to look like modern tennis rackets, where you had catgut strings stretched over a frame. And don't worry, catgut is really not made from cats. The shuttlecock that was batted around was simply a piece of cork with a rounded end, and then you took feathers of the same size, trimmed them the same way, and then fitted them at equidistances around the top of the cork. The set that you see on the right in the picture, we took this at Williamsburg last year in one of the museums. And this set actually came from the first hospital for mental health patients in the United States. Now, the game of battledore and shuttlecock first cropped up in print in 1529, according to the Oxford English Dictionary. And the quote is, "I trow all will be not worth a shuttlecock." But Joseph Strutt, that we heard about earlier, said that shuttlecock is represented in an illustration from a manuscript of the 14th century. And you see the illustration below with the old-fashioned rackets, which look more like ping pong paddles, and a pretty big birdie that they seem to be batting around. The game started to evolve in the 1800s. It was adapted by British officers who were stationed in India. And they added a net and they called the game Pune after the name of the town where they were stationed. The game made its way back to England by the 1870s, and it got its current name when the Duke of Beaufort gave a garden party at his house and had people playing the game. When they went away, they referred to it by the name of the house, which was Badminton House. If we move on to more active games, we have to talk about Catherine Morland, who was the most tomboyish of all of Jane Austen's heroines. In the opening chapter of Northanger Abbey, we hear it was not very wonderful that Catherine, who had by nature nothing heroic about her, should prefer cricket, baseball, riding on horseback, and running about the country at the age of 14 to books. We have 2 games to talk about here, cricket and baseball, and they are at least cousins because they have a common ancestor. This is stool ball. Stool ball dates back to the 11th century when milkmaids played a game with their stools and a ball. And it became very popular in medieval times, and unusually it evolved into a game that was played by both sexes. And here's an engraving from that time of a man and a woman playing stool ball. Now, it was very popular among the young people because the boys and the girls could play this together. So here is a song from 1694 that talks about playing stool ball. Down in a vale on a summer's day, all the lads and lasses meet to be merry. A match for kisses at stool ball to play, and for cakes and ale and cider and perry. We'll start with cricket. Jane Austen mentions cricket twice in her novels, and both times it's in the opening chapter of Northanger Abbey. And she mentions it just once in her letters, where she says Edward Bridges had been strange to tell too late for the cricket match. But her niece, Fanny Knight, wrote that by 1816, her brothers had developed a craze for country crickets, and neighborhood gentlemen played while the ladies looked on, and it is all very pleasant. Cricket started out in the schoolyard and then moved to the village green. And again, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, the first written reference was in 1598, when a pupil from a Surrey school testified in court that he had played cricket there in 1555. Early village cricket developed by 1650. Here's a picture of an early game. And if you know anything about cricket, you can tell from the picture that there are three significant differences between 1650 cricket and modern day cricket. First of all, the wicket only has 2 stumps instead of 3. The ball is bowled along the ground instead of being thrown overhand. And because it's along the ground, the bat is shaped more like a hockey stick. But by the following century, cricket, according to Roy Porter, moved from the village green to the estate. And Lord Chesterfield wrote to his son in 1774, "You will desire to excel all boys your age at cricket." So here we have the first example of a helicopter sports parent. Now, if we saw his son ready to play cricket, he might look like this picture. This is Prince Adolphus Frederick, who was the 7th son of King George III. And he's dressed in a gentleman's attire for cricket at the time. He's wearing a frilled shirt, a waistcoat, nankeen breeches, silk stockings, shoes with little heels, buckles, and the cricket bat that he has already looks much more like a modern cricket bat. Now, cricket didn't make much impact in the United States, but it did come over with the settlers in the 1700s. And the first mention of it in this country was in 1737, when a Georgia planter wrote about playing cricket on the village green. But by the time of the Revolutionary War, all things English had become extremely unpopular and cricket died out. But it did have a lasting impact in America, and here it is. When John Adams and the other framers of the Constitution were discussing what to call the leader of the country, John Adams is supposed to have said, "Fire companies and cricket clubs have presidents, so should we." Turning to baseball, the earliest recorded reference to baseball was once thought to be in the opening chapter of Northanger Abbey. But in 2007, the Major League Baseball organization sent a film crew to England to look into the early background of baseball in that country. And while they were there, they got a call from a lady in Surrey who said that she had found in her garden shed a previously unknown diary from 1755 by the Surrey lawyer and historian William Bray. William Bray was a man who was well known for his diaries. He kept them most of his adult life, starting at age 19, and he lived to be 97 years old. The diary that she found had this passage in it. And you can see where the arrow is pointing that that's the mention of baseball. The print there is different from the script and the rest of the letter, which makes us think that baseball was a new game for him and he was trying to make it stand out. And the other thing we notice here is that he's going to play with some of his neighbors, and it's both ladies and gentlemen who are playing. That claim didn't last long, though, because in 2011, the baseball historian Thorne posted the earliest known record of English baseball from a little pretty pocketbook in 1744. And here's the engraving that shows the game being played with a little poem and a little moral to go with it. And the things you notice here is that there are three boys playing. The one on the left has a ball. The other one is preparing to strike it with its hand. So they weren't using a bat then. And the bases that we see were posts instead of being flat on the ground. By the early 1800s, though, baseball had changed and it became a game for schoolgirls. And it was so well known in that context that there's a science textbook from the early 1800s that explains the concept of inertia by using baseball as an example. And boys started playing rounders. Rounders is a lot like baseball, American baseball. It's a slightly rougher game because instead of tagging the runners out, players have to hit them by throwing the ball in their direction. The infield is a little bit different. There are not 4 bases, there are 5. But other than that, it's almost baseball. Now, if you look up baseball history online, you're going to read things that make it sound like it originated in America. But based on what we've seen here, the name and the basics of the game are obviously English. Christmas games were especially important for the children. Christmas was a highlight of the year for the children at Godmersham, and that was the estate that was inherited by Jane Austen's brother Edward. And his daughter Fanny recorded some of the games that they played at Christmas. We're going to take a look at Oranges and Lemons, Snapdragon, and Bullet Pudding. Now, except for rounders, most of the games that we've looked at so far have been pretty innocent. You're not very likely to get hurt. Well, we're going to have one more relatively quiet game, and then we're going to have 2 that I'm not signing up to play. Oranges and Lemons is a lively combination of London Bridge and tug of war. And the oranges and lemons are the names of the 2 sides in the tug of war part of the game. And the way it worked was that you would pick out 2 of the taller children to be the leaders. They would stand and hold hands to form an arch. The other children would hold on to each other, run around in circles while the older children sang this song. Oranges and lemons say the bells of St. Clemens. Here comes a candle to light you to bed, and here comes a hatchet to chop off your head. And when they got to the word head, they would drop the arch and catch one of the children. And then they would pick, are you orange or lemon, to divide them up into sides. And after the division into sides, they would do the tug of war. The 2 tall girls would hold on to each other, the others would line up behind them, and then they would pull until one side fell down. Now, here's the game that sounds dangerous to me, Snapdragon. Defined in 1876 as a Christmas gamble, raisins and almonds being put into a bowl of brandy and the candles extinguished, the spirit is set on fire and the company scramble for raisins. Now, even though brandy doesn't get as hot as you would think when you do this, and they say the flames are not that bad either. Here's a picture of it. So we're looking at tiny children standing around flaming brandy, putting their hands in to pick up burning raisins and then popping them into their mouths. Now, from what I read, that could be painful, so I'm not going to recommend that game. I'm not going to recommend this one either. I wouldn't try this one at home. Bullet Pudding. Fanny Knight wrote about this. You must have a large pewter dish filled with flour, which you must build up into a sort of pudding with a peak at the top. And then you must place a bullet on top. And everybody cuts a slice, and the person that is cutting when the bullet falls must poke about with their noses and chins to find it, and then take it in their mouths, which makes them strange figures all covered with flour. But the worst is you must not laugh for fear of the flour getting up your nose and mouth and choking you. You have seen this game if you have seen the 2020 version of Emma, where the children, the girls at Mrs. Goddard's school, are playing bullet pudding. And of course, the big loser is the hapless Harriet Smith, who winds up totally covered in flour. Word games. Jane Austen's family loved word games. They played things like charades, riddles, acrostics, and enigmas. We'll start with Emma, which is full of puzzles and word games. We read early on that Emma's friend Harriet Smith was collecting and transcribing all the riddles of every sort that she could meet with into a thin quarto of hot press papers made up by her friend and ornamented with ciphers and trophies. And for these kind of books, pressed flowers, ribbons, invitations, scraps of music, all kinds of things might be pasted in. Mr. Elton was the only one whose assistant she asked. He was asked to contribute any really good enigmas, charades, or conundrums that he might recollect. Before they could consult Mr. Elton, though, Emma's father, Mr. Woodhouse, remembers half a riddle. It's his famous "Kitty a fair but frozen maid, kindled a flame I yet deplore. The hoodwinked boy I call to aid, though of his near approach afraid, so fatal to my suit before." Well, Mr. Woodhouse says there's several more stanzas, and here they are. If we try to decipher this, we're going to look at the clean meaning of it, even though my friend Susan Allen Ford says this is actually quite naughty. We're going to take it literally and look at the key lines. So first, the hoodwinked boy. We know we're talking about a boy. We're afraid of his approach because it's fatal to my suit. This is my suit of clothes. So this is a dirty boy. And he goes up into the air and takes care of the problem from the fire. Well, if we think about this and put it together, we're talking about a chimney sweep. A charade is a puzzle that gives clues to the parts of the answer, and then the last lines will put it all together and describe the whole. Mr. Elton contributes 2 charades. One of them we remember because it's his famous courtship charade, but the other one, the first one, is an old chestnut, and here it is. My first doth affliction denote, which my second is destined to feel, and my whole is the best antidote, that affliction to soften and heal. Well, if we look at the gentleman on the right, he looks pretty woeful, and he's the one who's feeling it. So there's our man, and when we put them together, the help for him is a good woman. The next time we hear about word games is the Box Hill picnic. Frank Churchill and Emma are talking together, and he thinks everybody else is being too quiet. So he announces, "I am ordered by Miss Woodhouse to say that she requires something entertaining from each of you, either one thing very clever, or 2 things moderately clever, or 3 things very dull indeed." And she engages to laugh heartily at them all. Frank's father, Mr. Weston, offers a conundrum, which is a riddle with an answer that often involves a pun. He says, "What 2 letters of the alphabet are there that express perfection?" M and A for Emma. Well, Mr. Knightley is unhappy with Emma's rude behavior to Miss Bates a few minutes before, and he says perfection should not have come quite so soon. Well, I ran across something in a book by David Selwyn called Jane Austen and Leisure from 1998. And he argues that this conundrum and the comment are based on a contemporary moral treatise, which uses a formula where M is the moment of good, A is ability. If M over A equals, if M equals A, M over A equals 1, which represents unity, and unity equals perfection of virtue. So this is not something made up for no reason. It's something that incorporates a work that Mr. Weston and Mr. Knightley could have been familiar with. At the same picnic, Mrs. Elton complains that word games are a waste of the out of doors. They're well enough around the fire at Christmas, but we don't need to do them while we're outside. But then she remembers an acrostic, which is a poem in which the first letter of each line spells out a word. And she said, I had an acrostic once sent to me upon my own name, which I was not at all pleased with. I know who it came from, an abominable puppy. Mrs. Elton's name was Augusta Hawkins. So on Augusta, I have written one that she's not going to like either. A lady by her own estimation, united Bath in true admiration, garnished with pearls and fine lace, used her charms to marry in haste. Said Mr. E, I gladly went thither to get the 10 thou that came with her, and Miss Woodhouse can jump in the river. And I thought it would be fun to ask my friends to write one too. And this is the contribution I got from Pat McGraw. And a lot of you will know Pat. He's been to several of the AGMs, and I know he's been to the Jane Austen summer program. He based his contribution on this quote from Mrs. Elton. Nobody can think less of dress in general than I do, but I would not wish to be inferior to others. And I see very few pearls in the room except mine. So here is Pat's ode to Ms. E. Peons of praise to our divine Ms. E, everyone's favorite wannabe. Anyone can be mean-spirited, small, reacting badly with a sneer to all losers like Miss Smith. Only she can seem sweetness and light, lamenting no ice cream. Judging for Jane, whom she is enslaving, and suckling up with barouche she is craving, mi caro sposo provides all the proof, showing why decent folks should hold aloof. So Pat has put together everything we know about Mrs. Elton to make Pearl Jam. The Austen family played games all the time, and surprisingly, many of their rhymes and puzzles have survived. And here's a charade that Jane herself wrote. You may lie on my first by the side of a stream, and my second composed to the nymph you adore. But if you've none of my whole, her esteem and affection diminish, think of her no more. By the side of a stream, we're on a bank. We're writing a note to the nymph we adore. And if we don't have any banknotes, we're not going to prosper. The Austens also played bourrimes, which is French for end rhymes. And the way this game worked was that each player must write a poem with the lines ending in a list of words given in a certain order. And the one that we have from the Austen family was played by Mrs. Austen and several of her grandchildren. And I'm going to show you the one that she wrote. The words are verse, sorrow, hearse, purse, and morrow. She wrote, why do you ask me to scribble in verse when my heart's full of trouble and sorrow? The cause I will briefly rehearse. I'm in debt with a sad empty purse, and the bailiffs will seize me tomorrow. The last one we're going to look at is called Noun Verse. This is another one that Mrs. Austen and her children and grandchildren all played together. The way this game worked was that players draw one slip of paper with a noun and another with a question. and they have to write a poem that answers the question and uses the noun. Now, the lines in the poem don't have to rhyme with the noun, it just has to appear at least once inside the poem. After Jane Austen's authorship of the novels became known in her family, they started playing games where they would write these answers in the voice of one of Jane Austen's characters. So for this particular one, where the noun was temper, and the question is, which is the prettiest brooch in the room? Jane Austen's niece, Caroline Austen, wrote in the voice of Mrs. Norris from Mansfield Park, and of course, she's complaining about Fanny Price. If I must speak, though really I'm ashamed to say it, but I think it not becoming for her to display it. Her kind and generous cousins, ma'am, her uncle and her aunt, it's much handsomer than mine or that of Mrs. Grant. And just this very evening, sorry to speak loud, but her poor dear mother's temper was also rather proud. The last thing we will look at is card games. Card games crop up quite often in Jane Austen's novels, and she writes about them frequently in her letters. In 1813, she wrote to Cassandra, "As soon as a whist party was formed and a round table threatened, I made my mother an excuse and came away, leaving as many for their round table as there were at Mrs. Grant's. I wish that they might be as agreeable a set." Playing cards was by far the most popular pastime in Jane Austen's novels, and I know because I counted them. Dancing comes in second, but leading the pack, definitely playing cards. One of the reasons for the popularity of cards was gambling. And in an early book of instructions for card games, Richard Seymour wrote in 1734, "Gaming has become so much the fashion amongst the beau monde that he who in company should appear ignorant of the games in vogue would be reckoned low-bred and hardly fit for conversation." And what you should do is buy his book so that you can learn to play all the fashionable card games. The gambling in Jane Austen's book was mostly on a small scale. There were a couple of exceptions. Of course, George Wickham had thousands of pounds in gambling debts, and Tom Bertram had spent so much money on his own gambling that Sir Thomas was forced to sell the living that he held in trust for Tom's brother. But for the most part in the books, the card games were at home and they were often played for fish, which we saw earlier, small gambling tokens made of ivory or bone that could be treated like chips in a casino or traded in for prizes at the end of an evening's play. We remember in Pride and Prejudice that Lydia, after the card party at Aunt Philip's, cannot stop talking about the fish she had won and the fish she had lost. But there is another mention, and this is the only other time that fish are mentioned in Jane Austen's works. During the card play at Rosings, Mr. Collins is kept busy thanking Lady Catherine for every fish he won and apologizing if he thought he won too many. So in all the novels, we hear about fish twice. Now, we don't hear too much about money actually being mentioned, but in Emma, Mrs. Goddard comes to Hartfield to win or lose a few sixpences with Mr. Woodhouse. And Jane herself, at a card party in 1808, can only play one round because the stake is 3 shillings, and she can't afford to lose that twice in one evening. There are 11 sociable card games altogether mentioned in the novels and the letters. And here is a page from one of Edmund Hoyle's books for card game instructions that has the Austen games highlighted. Now, the 2 left columns are the card games, except for dominoes at the bottom. So you can see she talks about more than half of the games in this book. The games fall into 3 basic categories: round games, games for 4, and games for 2. Round games were the games for young people. These were sociable games played for fun. And those are lottery, 21, speculation, brag, commerce, and loo. The games before were played with partners, and they tended to be more sedate games played probably by the older people. Whist, quadrille, and casino. And the older people we hear about with Mrs. Bates in Emma, where she's described as being a very old lady past almost everything except tea and quadrille. And then the games for two are cribbage and, as the English pronounced it, picket, which is the oldest of all the games. Now, some of these games are still around today. Vingt-un is exactly the same as blackjack. Whist, the most popular game then, remains one of the most popular games in England today. Casino, I remember playing that game when I was a little girl. And finally, cribbage, if you walk into a toy store today, you can buy a cribbage board and the cards to go with it. I'm going to teach you how to play one of these games, and the reason why I chose brag is that it's a combination of two games that many people will already know how to play, and those two games are poker and blackjack. Jane Austen wrote about brag in 1808 when she was at Godmersham and playing with her nieces and nephews. The preference of brag over speculation mortifies me deeply, because speculation was under my patronage. And what is there so delightful in a pair royal of braggers? It is but 3 nines or 3 knaves or a mixture of them. Well, we're going to learn what a pair royal is and why that's important in this game. So play begins by using tokens. Everybody should have the same number of tokens, and you need a large number because you're going to lose your money really fast in this game. So you start out by adding up to each of 3 piles in the middle to form the pools for the game. 3 cards are dealt to each player, 2 face down and the 3rd face up. The first round is the easy one. All you have to do is have the high card that's turned up. One little twist is the ace of diamonds is the high card for this round. Otherwise, everything is ranked high to low as usual from ace down to 2. If there's a tie, the pool is won by the player closer to the dealer's left. The fun starts in round 2. Round 2 is the poker round. And there are 2 very odd wild cards for this, the 9 of diamonds and the jack of clubs. And when I've played this game with friends, I print out a sheet of paper that shows the wild cards because they're really hard to remember. To start this round, the players look at their turned down cards, but they don't show them to the other player. So you know what you have, but they don't. The hands are ranked high to low by a natural pair royal, 3 of a kind, a pair royal with 1 or 2 wild cards, or any kind of pair, which is 2 of a kind or 1 and a wild card. Play begins in this round with any player may say, I brag, and put down a stake. So you might say, I brag, and I wager 2 fish. If no one answers, then the bragger wins the second pool. But if one person decides to challenge the bragger, then they start betting back and forth like it's poker. So you can see that bet, and I'll raise you 2. I'll see that, and show me your cards. Well, the player who stays in the longest and has the higher ranking hand is the one who wins the second pool. Then we move on to the 3rd round where the players turn up their other 2 cards. This is the blackjack round. And in this round, face cards and aces are worth 10 points, and the numerical cards have their regular face value. The object of the game, not to reach 21, but 31 this time. And you do it by drawing cards from the deck that the dealer is holding. And you start with the player to the dealer's left, and that player will draw as many cards as he or she wants, and then it'll pass on to the next one. If you are the first person to reach 31, you automatically win the 3rd pool. Anybody going over 31 is out. If nobody reaches 31, the pool goes to the player who's closest to 31 in total. So if we play the game with the cards that we have here, We have a total of 13 points to start with. So obviously we're going to draw another card and we get a 9. Now, that brings us up to 22 points, and you have to make a decision based on the odds. Are you likely to draw a 10, Jack, Queen, King, or Ace, or are you likely to draw something smaller? Odds are you'll get something smaller, so you go for it again. I have the feeling you can't see this because my face is hiding it, but the next card this person draws is a King, which puts you at 32 and you lose. The last thing that Jane Austen played, the last game of all, was a solitaire game. She would have called it Patience. In 1817, the year that she died, she wrote to her niece Fanny Knight, "Many thanks for your kind care for my health. I certainly have not been well for many weeks. Sickness is a dangerous indulgence at my time of life. Tell William, who is Fanny's brother, I often play at 9s and think of him." I'm going to show you how to play 9s. A single pack of cards is used. You shuffle the deck and lay 9 cards in 1 or 2 rows on the table. Now 9 is the key word here because what you're going to do is pick up and set aside in a stack all the 9s, any pair of cards adding up to 9, and any sequence of 10, Jack, Queen, King. And you will replace these with cards from the remaining deck. And the game continues as you pick up cards and replace cards. And if you look at what we have on the right, you can pick up a 9, an ace, and an 8. You can pick up a 4 and a 5 and a 7 and a 2 and a 6 and a 3. So you can actually pick up all of those cards. That doesn't happen very often. But then you'll just deal out 9 more cards and keep going. So you continue with this until either you cannot pick up any more cards or you have played and picked up all of the cards and then you are the winner. When you learn a new game like this, especially solitaire, the question you want to ask is, how likely am I to win this game? Well, I played a lot of rounds of this. You don't win that often, but that doesn't really answer the question. So the way that mathematicians will determine something like this, it's actually a hard problem to solve. But what they will do is write a computer program to play the game and then run it over and over again. So a solver was run on 1 million plays with this game, and 5.44% of the game were solvable, an average of 11 cards being removable in a given round. And in 5.55% of the games, you couldn't remove any cards at all. So you have about a 1 in 20 chance of winning and a 1 in 20 chance of going absolutely nowhere. Now, the form of solitaire that most people in America are familiar with is called Klondike. And Klondike, again, is a hard problem for a mathematician to solve, but someone out there ran 100 million plays of the game and came up with 8.7%. So even though that game is a little more complex than 9, it's actually easier to win. So I hope that you will try some of these games. If you're interested in learning more about the cards, check out my book, Jane Austen's Card Games, with complete instructions for all of the games. And this is great fun to play with your friends. Before the pandemic started, we were getting together with friends and going through all the card games in the books. So if you have any questions or comments for me that you don't get answered in the questions session, please email me at jo.a.staples@vanderbilt.edu. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. As we begin the Q&A, just a reminder to everyone, you can continue to drop in questions using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. If you put them in the chat, we might not see them, so just make sure they go in the Q&A box. So to begin, someone has a question on the bullet in the bullet pudding. Was that an actual bullet, like for a gun, or is that slang for something else?
That was an actual bullet. This was a small round pellet that was fired from a bullet that would have been loaded with some sort of firing wadding, and it would have propelled that round ball out. So in the Revolutionary War, for example, this is the type of bullet that would have been used.
I think in the Emma movie, that's actually a coin, isn't it? That's used for the game that Harriet plays. Is that right?
Oh, I wish I could have gone back and looked. I didn't have a chance to do that.
So someone asked about that your image with Spillikins actually showed some instructions on there. Are there instructions for Spillikins available online anywhere?
There are a lot of different articles about Spillikins online. So all you have to do is put that in and you can find out lots of things about it.
Including how to score?
Well, the scoring, when you play pickup sticks, it's just 1 point for each stick you can pick up without disturbing other sticks. But in this one, if you were playing with the kind of game that had different shaped sticks, each one of them would have been marked with the point value.
Thank you.
So how young would people begin to learn some of these various games?
Actually quite young. If you have read Parson Woodford's diaries, he makes a record of his wins and losses, the amount of money that he wins and loses at playing games in his family. And one of the people that he plays with is his niece, Nancy. And she's young when they start, and she is playing with her own money. And they will win or lose a few pennies or a shilling. And children were encouraged to keep accounts of their wins and losses. And the young princesses back in Tudor times, Princess Elizabeth, kept a record of the amounts of money that she won and lost playing cards. And apparently she was a terrible loser, so she wound up winning a lot of games.
Can these games that you've mentioned today be played with regular cards that we use in the US?
All the card games here are played with standard decks of cards.
What about board games? What kind of board games do we see from the period? Our question asker mentioned Fox and Geese. What have you come across?
We're talking about board games?
Yes.
Was that the question?
Yes.
Thank you. Your sound was a little staticky.
Right.
Backgammon is mentioned several times in the novels. They also talk about billiards is not really a board game, but it also comes up. They played chess. They called it drafts, but it was really checkers. So those are the ones that I've come across.
How about the moral prohibitions on gambling? How common were those in the time of Austen?
The moral prohibitions dated all the way back to the introduction of cards. The earliest records that we have about cards, the earliest written records in Europe and in England, were in laws forbidding their play, especially at certain times of the year. Henry VIII wanted to encourage people to practice things that would be useful in war. So he wanted them to practice things like archery and not to spend their time gambling. So he had a law that listed a specific number of games that people could not play except during Christmas time, and cards were one of them. There were a lot of writers who wrote about the moral issues of gambling. And of course, Jane Austen would have been familiar with these. And all of her characters who are serious gamblers are people that are not good character.
Where would these games be played? Would most of them be played in the home, like at private parties, or out of the house somewhere?
Some of these games were played at home. Some of them were played with people in the neighborhood. The team sports, obviously like cricket and baseball and similar things, would have been a gathering of people coming in. But games like cards were played both in the home and in public settings, because we see that for the gentlemen, especially when they accompany their wives and children to a ball, will disappear immediately into the card room. Mr. Allen does that at the beginning of Northanger Abbey. In the Watsons, Mr. Edwards will stay for the ball as long as his luck is holding out with the cards. If he starts to lose, he wants to go home. So these could be played in public settings. Things like chess and drafts, for example, would have been played in the clubs and the pubs. Billiards, obviously, in the clubs. We hear about John Thorpe playing billiards with General Tilney, and that would have been in the club.
How popular were bowling games at the time, and what was the connection to class? Is this something that was more lower class, certainly more rural, I would imagine?
Bowling was actually quite popular. Some of the great houses had their own bowling greens. That's my hometown, by the way. And I always wondered where it came from when I was little. But yes, people did do bowling quite a bit. It's mentioned in Parson Woodford's diaries. It's also mentioned in William Bray's diaries. They would set up in the road if they didn't have any place else, but obviously it was nicer to set it up on the grass. They would have special sets for these things, and it was a popular children's game too. But for the adults, it would have been, like all of these others, another betting game.
When card players exchanged their fish for prizes, do you know who provided the prizes and what sort of prizes they might receive?
This would have been something that was likely to happen at Mrs. Phillips' card party, because that's where the young people are playing with the fish. And you get the idea that Mr. Wickham does not want to play whist, because basically he's a professional card player. So he comes over to the table where they're not playing for money. And that means they're likely to be playing for small prizes. And these would have been provided by the hostess of the evening.
Is cribbage today played the same and scored the same as at the time of Jane Austen?
It can be. There are actually several different versions of cribbage, and I picked the one that seemed the most straightforward to me to put it in the book. So it's hard to tell from what you read in Jane Austen's time, but if you compare the instructions today with the instructions from the books of that era, it's a very similar game.
What about croquet? Was that something they would have played in this era?
Croquet was called Pall Mall, and it was played not over a small course like we play it on today, but it could be played over the whole length of a town. And they played with these very large balls that were made out of, let me think what the word is, boxwood. They're made out of boxwood, and they hit them with a mallet, which seems to have been swung more like a polo mallet than anything else. So the game would have looked different, but you were still trying to get the ball through something that resembled a modern day wicket. And the Pall Mall Street in London was actually originally a croquet court for the king.
So one of our listeners is asking, where can we find those bourrim or those end rhyme games that you mentioned?
I have provided a bibliography for you, and those games are in David Selwyn's Poetry from Jane Austen and Her Family. And there's also another reference there that includes some of these, but I don't think there's anything in that second one that is not in David Selwyn's book.
Great. And this is the bibliography that we'll be sending out to people after your talk.
Yes. Yes.
One person brought up the similarity between these games and the type of games you might find these days hosted by like a church or at a bingo night. They're asking, would this be something that the churches or parsons back then might organize for the community, or is that something not really done back then?
I honestly don't know the answer to that question. I know that the parsons themselves were very fond of playing whist, but they usually went to the clubs in the town or to private homes to do that. I don't know that they would have organized things, particularly for children, in the same way that we do, because children were more likely to have their entertainments at home.
So again, there's a lot of interest in this, the gambling aspect. One of our participants asks, what is the difference between gaming and gambling?
It basically means the same thing. They would have called it gaming and would have called someone like Mr. Wickham a gamester. That's what Jane Bennett says. A gamester, I had no idea of it.
Who made these game materials? Were there several different companies that were known for making games, or were these maybe an artisan thing produced locally?
Well, in the beginning, something like a battledore would have been hand carved. I found a book by a man named Francis Willoughby, which is an unfinished handwritten work about games. And what he does is he has little squiggly drawings showing you how to carve your own battledore and how to make your own shuttlecock. So these games would have been homemade in the beginning. But in the century before Jane Austen was born, people suddenly discovered children and started manufacturing games for them. So you would have had stores that sold toys, and you would have been able to buy the Bilbo Catch or a Spillikins game or something like tops. Tops were popular toys. Dolls for girls. In fact, that book that I mentioned that had the earliest mention of baseball I've never heard of this with any other book from the time, but this was a very early book that was produced for children. And it included, if you were a little boy, you got a ball. If you were a little girl, you got a pin cushion. So children's toys started to come in, I would say, in the 100 years before Jane Austen's time.
There was a 1970 Albert Finney version of Scrooge, or A Christmas Carol, that shows a fun word game called The Minister's Cat. Have you heard of that, or is there any indication that would have been played in England by Austen?
I have not heard of that. I have looked at a lot of books on word games, parlor games, and children's games, and I have never seen that one, but I'll have to look it up.
What about tennis in this era?
Tennis. Tennis goes back further than you think. When I was in England and went to Hampton Court, we saw Henry VIII's tennis court. Now, it was a different game because it was an indoor game, and it was played with kind of a saggy net, and the people sat up on kind of a balcony around the sides, and then the players wore their regular clothing and got out. I can't imagine hitting the ball under those circumstances, but they had thin rackets and a ball. So it couldn't have been easy. I do not find any mentions of tennis in Jane Austen's letters or her books. So it was not something that apparently she was familiar with, but the game was definitely around.
So would they ever play card games without betting? Our participant says it seems like betting at cards every night could really spoil some evenings and friendships.
Apparently, it was just an accepted part of the play. Every one of the games that I listed is a betting game, and that's just what people did. I suppose if you didn't have a lot of money, you would just play for fish, but they seem to have always played for money.
What about dice? Were these played with in family situations, or are they only used for gambling?
Ah, yes, we do hear about dice, and they played a game called Hazard, where you could win or lose huge amounts of money very quickly. There's a story about one gentleman I believe it was in the 1600s, who won in a single evening playing Hazard enough money to buy not a house, but a town. And after that, he gave up gambling and lived out the rest of his life on the proceeds of that one evening at Hazard. Again, we don't hear Jane Austen talking about dice. There were some children's games that involved a type of die where you would play games like we did with board games as children, where you would roll a die on your turn to see what you were supposed to do. So in that context, the die would have been familiar possibly to children of this era, but they would not have played a game like Hazard because that's only for gambling.
You showed some images of 18th century cards that looked quite like our standard deck. And yet we've also seen images of cards that looked very different. There's a question of, well, how they're different, but also where can one purchase cards that are more like those unusual 18th century ones?
Okay. The difference between modern cards and 18th century cards, there's several. First one is 18th century cards had white backs. There were no patterns on them until the middle 1800s. And the patterns that were first placed on cards were actually designed by the man who did all of the interior design work for the displays at the Great Exhibition in England. And the cards that you saw during Jane Austen's time had face cards with a single upright figure, so they weren't two-ended. Now, the reason why they changed that is because if you had upright figures, you're going to want to turn them in your hands so that you see them as being upright. So people will know that you have face cards in your hand. So again, these changes in cards came about during the 1800s. So they introduced the two-ended court cards during that time. The other big difference is that 18th century cards had no suits or numbers or letters in the corners of the cards. And that meant if you were dealt cards, all you would have were spots on the cards. And in order to see whether you had a 6 or a 7 or an 8 in your hand, you would need like 3 hands to hold all your cards. So the person who had the idea about putting the index in the corner invented something that are called squeezers. So you can squeeze your hand into a fan. Mm-hmm. So if you look at, for example, the satirical drawings of card players from Jane Austen's time, you can see the white backs. You can see the way they hold their cards. I'm not sure you can see the face cards, but you definitely can see the difference. Oh, and where can you find these cards? I got the ones that I have when we visited Mount Vernon. Some of these shops, like Colonial Williamsburg, would have them. You can order them from the gift shops online.
So during card or other games in an estate, would the conversations have contributed to discussions of politics, gossip, culture, or the participants mainly just focused on the game?
I think it depends on the game. If you're playing a round game, it doesn't take a lot of concentration. So there might be a lot of laughing and talking. You think about speculation in Mansfield Park, where Lady Bertram is totally clueless, but Henry Crawford is helping her out, but he's also helping Fanny, and he's being the general life of the party. So there would have been more fun, more conversation at the round games. The partner games tended to be more serious. And in fact, the original form of whist was called rough and honors, and then it got to be whisk and then whist. And supposedly the latter forms of the name came from the fact that people wanted you to be quiet while you were playing. So it was whoosh, be quiet.
Was Pope Joan or matrimony popular in Austen's time?
Actually, it was. Surprisingly, she doesn't mention it. But it's a game that is similar to one that we played years ago called Tripoli. But Pope Joan, you need a little equipment to play this game beside the cards and the counters. A Pope Joan board was something that I don't think you can find it today, but you can look it up online and you'll see some pictures of what it looked like. And again, this is a betting game, and the players have to, before the play starts, put their counters on the board to serve as the pools for play. And the board was round, and it had segments that were, inch or so in depth to hold the counters. Now, when we found out about this game, I thought it sounded like fun. So my husband, bless his heart, decided he was going to make one for us. So what we did was we went to a discount store and we got a Lazy Susan, which he stripped and put in the little wedges that you need and painted it and put the decoupage cards on it. So it looked very similar to what we see online. And we've played that a couple of times with friends. So it would probably be hard to find one of these unless you just ran across one in an antique shop, but you can make your own.
And an important question, where do we find your book? Some people have been trying to get it on Amazon, but it seems to be out.
Okay, I think the Amazon problem is due to the situation with COVID. I looked a couple of weeks ago, and said it was out. The next time I looked, it was back. So I think if you can't find it there, you can order it and they will get it. It's also available on Barnes & Noble. And as far as I know, the Jane Austen bookstore still has a few copies of it.
Maybe we can provide those links to our listeners as well.
Yes.
Yeah. Oops. Anne, I think might be frozen. I think Anne looks, are you frozen, Anne? Are you? I think she's frozen. The question Anne was going to ask is about the game Bridge, whether that was played under another name.
Bridge is a successor to whist, and it's like whist except with bidding, where you say you're going to make a certain number of tricks in a round. And bridge was developed in the late 1800s, and it very quickly overtook whist as the popular game of the day. So if you can play bridge, you're going to be a really good whist player.
I think a final question for tonight. How did you first get involved with this, both with Jane Austen, first of all, but then also with the games?
Well, I have loved Jane Austen since I discovered her in my high school library when I was a sophomore in high school. And I remember the librarian telling me I couldn't have that book because it was too advanced for me. And I checked it out anyway and fell in love. So I have loved Jane Austen for a long time. And after I retired, I thought I've always wanted to write something related to Jane Austen. So I started with the idea that I would write a big book where I had chapters that were based on food in one of the books and some sort of activity in the book. But when I got to the one on cards in Pride and Prejudice, I realized that that would make a whole book by itself. So that was the genesis. That was probably about 2016 or so. So I finished the book by 2017, and it's been out since then.
Very nice. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your presentation and all the interesting answers.
Oh, absolutely my pleasure. Thank you.
We also want to remind you that this whole series is free and will be available on Zoom But before we end, we have a few announcements, Emily.
Yes, it seems as if we perhaps lost Anne, so I'm going to go ahead and give her usual closing spiel. Thanks again to Jo Ann for such a fantastic presentation tonight. It's been so interesting, and I feel inspired to break out a deck of cards this evening. Anne, could you, now that you're back, do you want to talk to us a little bit about our next upcoming events?
Yes, we're really excited to continue our Staying Home with Jane Austen series. These are brand new. This is the first time we're announcing them. Our next one is going to be on October 20th. So we know a lot of you guys are preparing for the JazzNet AGM. So we're going to take a little bit of a break and resume in late October with Reading with Jane Austen with Susan Allen Ford, great friend of ours. She's going to be talking about reading practices and some of the authors that Jane mentions in her novels. This one, you can go ahead and register. It's up online at our website. And then on November 5th at 5 p.m. Eastern Time, it's going to be Gardening with Jane Austen. A couple sessions ago, someone gave us this idea to do a session on gardening, and we thought it was a great idea. So we're going to be welcoming Kim Wilson, who wrote a book on this subject. This one is not yet up on our website, but it will be tomorrow. So keep an eye out for that to register.
Great. And yes, we'd also like to take the time right now to announce the winners of our Crafting with Jane Austen contest. Our Crafting with Jane Austen speaker, Jenny Batchelor, served as one of our judges, and she wanted to extend her congratulations to everyone who participated. The submissions were delightful, and she and the other judges had a really hard time deciding on their top 3. But our grand prize winner is Leslie Hawley with her letter to Dearest Lady Russell. Our second prize winner is Nancy Martin Young with her story A Pocket for a Poppet. And third place goes to Jennifer Tinanga for Crafting with Mrs. Austen. Our high school winner is M.R. Tom for her story, The Struggles of Embroidery. Now, all of these stories will be posted to our website over the course of the next few weeks. And I'd also like to take a moment right now to announce our Playing Games with Jane Austen contest. Now, there will be more details of this coming to our website soon, but again, it's going to be a creative writing contest, and we will ask you to either make your own Regency character or inhabit the life of one of Jane Austen's characters and think about some of the conniving and scheming and maybe not so negative, but the other kind of play that goes on with gaming in Jane Austen's novels. Additionally, if you want to read more about Jane Austen or hear more about her and her lives and her afterlives, we'd like to invite all of you here today to join us for next summer's Jane Austen summer program hopefully it will be in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. This is a summer symposium that we do every year, and it features lectures, hands-on workshops, small discussion groups, and my favorite, a Regency ball, where we can all come together and celebrate both our love and our study of Jane Austen.
And Emily, those award-winning essays will also be published on our website, right?
Yes, they'll be published on their website and they'll receive prize.
Right. And thank you to the 200 or so people who attended today's event. If you enjoyed tonight's programming, please consider making a donation to the Jane Austen Summer Program. We are a registered nonprofit, so your donation is tax deductible in the US. And we would love to keep these events free and open to the public. And they allow us to bring in, your funds will allow us to bring in great speakers like Jo Ann Staples and our next speakers. But they also go to supporting our other activities, including our student essay contests and our teacher scholarships for attending the Jane Austen Summer Program. Thank you again, all, for attending.
Thank you, everyone. We hope you remain healthy and safe, and we'll see you next time at Reading with Jane Austen. Take care.
Thank you, Joanne.
And thank you, Joanne.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.